Okay, this is the review of the January 2013 Core 1 paper. This section is the chemistry section, so the one on C1. Okay, so the first question is C1H, is the last section in C1, which is about paints. It gives us some information about different pigments that are in paints. Remember, the pigments, the part of the paint that gives it its colour. And it asks us some questions about it. So whenever you get a question like this, you should see it as like a brilliant question, because you've got a table to talk about. So you want to have a look at all the information in the table. Don't miss any of it out. Make sure you read it all and think about it, and then answer the question. So the first one is, which pigment is phosphorescent? Now, phosphorescence is when a compound absorbs light and then re-emits it. So it's this column that you want to look at, and if you see here, absorbs light and gives light off later, then the answer for the first one is D. The second one is, it says, a toy tests the temperature of a baby's bath. Which pigment should the toy contain? Well, what you're looking for in this case is you're looking for what we call a thermochromic. So thermo meaning heat, and chromic meaning colour. So you're looking for a thermochromic pigment as opposed to a phosphorescent pigment. So you're looking for any pigment that will change colour with a change in temperature. And so if you look at each of these, you'll see that C is the most appropriate choice, or you could have put red as well. So the next question then is about the two different types of paint, and it says that there's two types in the table: oil-based and emulsion-based paints. And it says explain how each type dries. So to help us with this, if we think about emulsion paint first. Now, in an emulsion paint, what we've got is we have our pigment dispersed inside an oil binding medium, and then the solvent in this case is water. So the key thing about an emulsion paint is that the solvent is water. So what happens when this paint dries is that the water evaporates. Okay, so that was the first mark. If you're explaining how an emulsion paint dries, the water evaporates, and then the leftover pigments and oil that acts as the binding medium join together, and they form a tough layer on the surface that is the dried paint. The other type, the second mark, is about oil-based paints. And they're slightly different because the oil now constitutes both the binding medium and the solvent in the paint. So what happens now is that because the solvent is a hydrocarbon oil, that will evaporate, but then what happens then is that the hydrocarbon will oxidize with the air. So that just means it reacts with the air. So this is the key word that you had to have in your answer, that in an oil-based paint, when it dries, it oxidizes, and the oil is oxidized. You can still say that the some of the oil evaporates first, but this is the key point that you had to have for an oil paint. Okay, so the last question on paints then changes to the topic of nail varnish, and it says that in some countries nail varnishes are tested using animals. Some people think we should test cosmetics on animals, some people think that we shouldn't. Explain why people have different views. So effectively you've sort of got to put a plus point towards this and a negative point. So the main negative point is the idea of animal cruelty. Okay, so any mention of cruelty will score you a mark. You could have had any mention of any kind of ethical issue that someone may feel about this, the concept of animal rights, acting against some people's religious beliefs, the fact that the animals have no choice in whether they are tested on, and the fact that in reality testing on animals isn't always certain, because the results may be different to when they actually are eventually tested on humans. So there's the argument that it may not be valid in that case. So those are all sort of the negative points. The positive ones, the reason some people think we should, effectively come down to human safety. So the idea that we have to make sure that they are safe before we give them to human beings. We want to identify any possible side effects, and it is safer than testing on humans. Okay, so any of those points, and you would have got 2 marks, but one must have been positive and one must have been negative. So this question is now about oil, and it says the first question is, which crude oil is the best one to use to make fuel oil? Now, what you're looking for in this case is the composition of each of these that has the highest component of fuel oil, and that is clearly A, with 52.5%, so the answer to the first one is just A. The next question suggests why obtaining North Sea crude oil, so this one is North Sea, is beneficial to the UK. And what I would say is you need to think about the UK in particular in this. And it's a suggest question. Now, when you see a suggest question, that is technically like examiner speak for, we're asking you a question that doesn't exactly fit perfectly into the specification, but we're asking you to apply what you sort of know and use a little bit of common sense to sort of make a valid suggestion. So all of the points for this, none of these are overly scientific. They're all almost more economical or political. So the fact that if you look at the others, Arabia and Iranian heavy, both of those, the Middle East, we consider to be a politically unstable region. So the fact that it is politically unstable, or that there are wars going on there, mean that it's obviously more beneficial to the UK to source our oil from the North Sea. Because the North Sea is closer, there's also cheaper transport costs. It's more convenient. Both of those are key factors. And by sort of supporting local industries, we're boosting our own economy. The other useful aspect to this is that North Sea oil has the highest petrol content, which is useful. It also has the highest heating oil content. So both of those two things, if you'd mentioned even those 2 points, you could have got a mark. So even if you didn't go the sort of political route of answering this question and just sort of tried to analyse what you were shown in the graphic, then you could have got 2 marks for that. The other thing is that there is still, in the next question, it implies that each of these fuels have more than the required amount of fuel oil. So that fuel oil can then be used for cracking, which we'll discuss that links to the next question, so you could have also put that. Okay, all 4 crude oil samples contain more fuel oil than is needed. Explain how a refinery manager would overcome this problem. So we basically have an excess of fuel oil. We don't need that much in any of these cases. So what we do need is we need this top one. We need petrol and chemical feedstock, because that's obviously what we put into our cars. That's far more efficient. So you get 1 mark for simply saying that we're going to convert fuel oil into petrol. Or more useful fractions. That would be the other phrase you could use. The second mark is to identify how they would do this, which is a process called cracking. And you need to remember that cracking is the process whereby we convert large unuseful alkanes, so for example long chain molecules that are really, really long, made from carbon and hydrogen. Really long chains like that aren't very useful, so what we do is we break them down into a smaller chain that's slightly more useful. This would be petrol, and we also get out of this an alkene, and an alkene is any chemical with a double bond. So that's why we do cracking. We take unuseful large molecules and break them down into smaller, more useful alkanes, and also we make from this useful alkenes, it's the ending that's different, and the alkenes contain the double bond. Alkanes only contain single bonds. Which then leads us to our 6-mark question. So the question is, we're shown 3 different compounds here, ethene and 2 compounds formed from ethene, and we have to write about the types of compounds shown, So we have to basically give information about each one and explain the reactions in terms of how ethene is changed into compound A and compound B. Well, the first thing to note is that because it ends in ene and because there is a double bond, so you can write the fact that there's a double bond in this molecule, this is an alkene. So ethene is an alkene, the same as we just discussed in the previous question. It's also a hydrocarbon, and the reason it's a hydrocarbon is it contains only carbon and hydrogen. So that also gives us some information about some of the others. So compound B is also a hydrocarbon, but compound A isn't a hydrocarbon because it contains bromine. Now, because this contains a double bond, any compound that contains a double bond we can describe as unsaturated, which basically means it doesn't contain just single bonds. It's got a double bond in. Now, compound A is the opposite of that. Compound A is an example of a saturated compound because it only contains single bonds. The same is also true for compound B. Okay, it's also saturated. Now, in terms of how we change ethene into these two molecules, compound A, what's happened is we've added bromine to the ethene, and the double bond has been removed. Now that's the test for double bonds, or the test for unsaturation. So in order to form compound A, what we've done is what we call an addition reaction. So we add bromine water to anything that we think has got a double bond, and if it goes colourless, then there is a double bond there, and this is an addition reaction. You could have also had that this compound is a dibromo compound, because it's got two bromines in it. And that's it pretty much for compound A. For compound B, what's happened now is we take lots of the double bond molecules, which we call monomers of ethene. So we could have also had a mark for saying that this is a monomer, and we convert this into a polymer, which is a long chain of ethene molecules, but you can see the double bond has been broken, so the double bond breaks and it joins onto the next molecule, and that carries on to form a ridiculously long chain. You could have also got marks if you just said what we need in a polymerization reaction, and there are two things we need. We need high pressure for polymerization to occur, and we also need a catalyst in order to make the reaction work. So the last question then is on pollutants. Karen thinks that the pollutants A, C and D all cause acid rain. Does the evidence support this? Explain your answer. You may want to have a look at this before, and just pause the video for a second before answering. So you should have worked out the answer to this is no, and the reason is because if you look at A, it's got a pH of 8, and that means it's alkali, so it can't cause acid rain for that reason. It also has no effect on marble or on calcium carbonate, and it has no effect on steel. It doesn't increase rusting, all of which would be evidence of it being an acid. So C and D do both of these things. They are acidic, they do affect marble, and they do increase rusting. So C and D do cause acid rain, but A does not. So you simply had to just comment on each of these three columns in the table. The last question is on catalytic converters. So the first question is an easy one because it's about an equation. So it says carbon monoxide reacts with nitrogen monoxide, and it says that carbon dioxide and nitrogen are made. So we always circle reacts and made because that tells us what our reactants and our products are. So we're going to get CO, carbon monoxide, plus NO goes to CO2, carbon dioxide, plus N2, and then we need to balance that for our second mark, and when we've done that, what we should have done is we should put a 2 in front of everything apart from the nitrogen. That's our second mark. The last mark then is why is it important that air pollution is controlled. Explain why. You could have had anything from the idea that air quality needs to be maintained, so that air is safe to breathe, to reduce the effects of asthma, to prevent harm to living organisms, to reduce or control photochemical smog, or to protect buildings, to reduce damage to the ozone layer, to reduce global warming. A whole host of answers you could have had for the final question, and that would have been 2 marks.